Everyone who saw Amara and Tunde together believed they were one of those rare couples that had figured life out early. They looked effortless, like two people who understood each other without speaking, like attraction had naturally grown into something deeper and stable. At events, they moved in sync. At dinners, they laughed at the same time. Even online, their photos carried that polished warmth people quietly envied. But what most people couldn't see was that their connection wasn't as simple as it looked. Beneath the chemistry and the admiration was a structure, something carefully built, quietly maintained, and rarely questioned. Amara had always understood something about relationships that many people only realize too late. Attention is power. Not loud, obvious power, but subtle influence. The kind that shifts decisions, softens resistance, and creates dependence without ever needing to demand it. When she met Tunde in Lagos, she recognized early that he was driven but emotionally open in a way he didn't fully understand. He liked to feel wanted. He liked reassurance, even if he never asked for it directly. And she knew how to give it, just enough to keep him leaning in. Their early relationship was intense. Conversations lasted hours, and their physical connection felt effortless, almost magnetic. Tunde interpreted that closeness as compatibility, as proof that they were aligned. For Amara, it was something slightly different. It was connection, yes, but it was also positioning. Without saying it out loud, she learned that intimacy didn't just bring them closer, it gave her influence. When she was warm and affectionate, Tunde became more agreeable, more flexible, more willing to meet her halfway or even go beyond that. After they got married, life accelerated the way it often does in a modern city. New apartment, bigger responsibilities, career pressure, bills that didn't wait, expectations from both families. On the outside, they were building a life that looked successful and stable. Inside, their dynamic was evolving in ways neither of them fully paused to examine. It started subtly. During disagreements, Amara would withdraw, not dramatically, but just enough for Tunde to feel the shift. The warmth would fade, the easy closeness would disappear, and he would notice. At first, he thought it was normal. Every relationship had phases, he told himself. Stress, work, mood, it all played a role. But over time, he began to associate resolution with something specific. When things needed to be fixed, when tension needed to dissolve, intimacy would return, and with it, a quiet understanding that things would now go Amara's way. Amara didn't see it as manipulation. In her mind, she was maintaining balance. The world wasn't always fair, especially not for women navigating expectations from marriage, society, and family. If she had found a way to secure her position, to ensure she wasn't overlooked or dismissed, then it felt justified. She wasn't shouting, she wasn't demanding, she was simply influencing outcomes. And it worked. Decisions about finances, social obligations, even major life choices often tilted in her direction. Not aggressively, not obviously, but consistently. Tunde adjusted, he compromised. Sometimes he didn't even realize he was giving in. To him, it felt like love required flexibility, like marriage required sacrifice. And because the closeness between them always returned, because the emotional and physical bond seemed intact, he never questioned the pattern deeply. But patterns, especially quiet ones, don't stay invisible forever. Over time, something in Tunde began to shift. It wasn't sudden, it didn't come from a single argument or a dramatic moment. It was gradual, almost unnoticeable at first. He became busier at work, more focused on his own goals. He started finding satisfaction in his achievements, in spaces that didn't depend on Amara's validation. The need he once carried, the subtle pull toward reassurance began to fade, and with it, something else faded too. When Amara withdrew during disagreements, he still noticed, but he didn't react the same way. The urgency was gone. The need to fix things immediately, to restore the warmth at any cost, slowly disappeared. At first, Amara assumed it was temporary. Stress, she thought. Maybe he was distracted. Maybe he would return to the version of himself she understood. But weeks turned into months, and the dynamic didn't reset. The same distance that once unsettled him no longer had the same effect. The same patterns no longer produced the same results. And for the first time, Amara felt something unfamiliar, uncertainty. She tried adjusting, more attention, more warmth, more intentional closeness. But something felt different even to her. Before, her actions had been calculated, controlled. Now they carried a different energy, one she didn't like to admit. It felt like effort. It felt like reaching. It felt like she was trying to hold on to something that was slipping away. Tunde, on the other hand, wasn't reacting with anger or resentment. He wasn't distant in a dramatic way. He was calm, grounded, present, but no longer dependent. He still spoke to her, still shared space with her, but the invisible thread that once tied his responses to her actions had loosened, and that confused her more than anything. It would have been easier if he was upset, easier if he argued, if he accused, if he reacted strongly, but he didn't. He simply stopped playing a role she didn't even realize he had been playing. One evening, after a quiet day that felt heavier than usual, Amara tried to return to what had always worked. Soft tone, familiar gestures, the kind of closeness that once reset everything between them. But this time, when she reached for him, Tunde gently stopped her. Not with rejection, not with anger, just clarity. He looked at her, steady and calm, and said something she wasn't prepared for. "We need something real." That was it. No long speech, no accusations, just a sentence that carried more weight than anything he had ever said before. In that moment, everything shifted. For the first time since their relationship began, Amara had no strategy, no adjustment, no immediate way to regain control of the situation. Because what he was asking for wasn't something she could manage or influence. It was something she had avoided building. Truth. And truth doesn't respond to tactics. That night, and in the days that followed, Amara began to see their relationship differently. Not as a love story that naturally worked, but as a system, one she had shaped, maintained, and relied on. A system where closeness was sometimes genuine, but often conditional, where influence replaced openness, where control quietly filled the spaces where vulnerability should have been. It hadn't felt wrong when it was working. It had felt smart, protective, necessary. But now, without that system functioning, she was left with something unfamiliar. A relationship that required honesty without leverage. A connection that couldn't be guided through subtle control. A partner who no longer responded to the cues she had mastered. And that was harder than anything she had faced before. Tunde, on his part, wasn't perfect. He realized that his own dependency had allowed the pattern to exist for so long. He had accepted dynamics without questioning them, had prioritized comfort over clarity. But stepping out of that cycle gave him something he hadn't expected. Peace. Not the kind that comes from everything being perfect, but the kind that comes from no longer negotiating your sense of self in silence. Now, they stood in a space that many couples eventually reach but rarely talk about openly. A space where the old way of relating no longer works and the new way hasn't fully formed yet. A space filled with questions that don't have easy answers. Could they rebuild something genuine without the patterns that once held them together? Could Amara learn to connect without controlling outcomes? Could Tunde open up again without slipping back into dependency? Or had they already gone too far in a direction that couldn't be undone? The truth is, many modern relationships operate on systems that aren't always visible. Power doesn't always come from money or status. Sometimes it hides in attention, in silence, in affection, in the ability to give or withdraw something the other person values deeply. But when any of those become tools instead of expressions, something fundamental begins to shift. Because real connection doesn't need to be negotiated. It doesn't depend on calculated timing or controlled access. And it doesn't survive on conditions that only work one way. Amara eventually understood something that changed how she saw everything. Not just her marriage, but herself.
Control can create stability, but it cannot create trust. It can maintain closeness, but it cannot guarantee connection. And once the other person stops responding to it, all that remains is what was real from the beginning. For her, that realization came with discomfort, with reflection, with the kind of honesty that forces you to confront parts of yourself you've avoided. But it also came with a choice: to continue trying to control what was already slipping away, or to finally build something that didn't require control at all. And for Tunde, the choice was just as complex: to walk away from a dynamic that no longer felt right, or to stay and rebuild something unfamiliar, something uncertain, but potentially real. In the end, their story wasn't about who was right or wrong. It was about what happens when the invisible systems inside a relationship stop working and the people inside it are forced to face what's left. Because eventually, control fades. And when it does, only truth remains.